Good morning and welcome to Prime Time at St. George's. We are so sorry that we can't be live again, but we are being prudent and we encourage you to be here for worship on Sundays, but some of the weekday events we are doing differently. So, to open ourselves and offer an opening prayer, the Reverend Roger Seneschal, he is our clergy, all clergy are pastoral counselors, but he's our senior pastoral counselor. And Roger, would you come up and offer prayers?
Good morning. Sewell, asked me if I would lead us in prayer during this season of challenges, and I am honored to do so. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us safely to this new day and to this new year. One lesson this dragged-out pandemic has taught us is how fragile life really is and how vulnerable we really are. We certainly do not know what the future holds, but we do know that you, Lord, hold the future. And for that, we are supremely thankful and hopeful. The Bible reminds us that whatever befalls us, you will either spare us from harm or will see us through it. Thus, we can face the future with confidence, knowing that you are by our side and will give us everything we need to win the battle. My Lord and Good Shepherd, help me not to be anxious. I know that whatever I am facing right now, you are right here with me and have promised to never leave me or forsake me. You know all my challenges. Help me to trust you regardless of the circumstances that surround me. Lord, when I am tempted to be anxious, help me to remember your promises and to overcome the attacks on my mind with answers from your holy word. Let me be quick to respond to wrong thinking and desires by replacing them with good thoughts. Thank you, Lord, that you always light the way before me. Amen.
Thank you, Roger. You have certainly said what we needed to hear. I want to tell you, come on up here, Robin. You all already know Robin, I hope, and if you don't, you should know her. She is our staff person for pastoral care and senior ministries, and she is a busy, busy person, so we're delighted to have her on the staff as a member of the congregation. She's a registered nurse and just has that wonderful nurse caring feeling.
Thank you, sir.
Well, you're my buddy. Okay. Now, we have two opportunities for you next week. One is stay at home and one is get out of the house. So let me tell you about both of them. Next Tuesday, we are having a Zoom teleconference, a tour of the Frist Museum art of the 13th and 14th centuries from Bologna, Italy. These are Bibles, huge Bibles. Even where the students have inscribed on the sides, they've made notes on the side of the manuscripts. They have hymnals and books of this nature. And Agatha Nolan from St. George's and a docent at Frist will be doing a Zoom tour of this, including the artwork where, as I say, you will probably see the only painting ever of Jesus holding a puppy dog. So There are a lot of reasons to enjoy this with Agatha. It'll be about a 45-minute. You will get a link because you've signed up and registered with Robin, and she sends you a link for your computer, and also how to use a Zoom link if you haven't done it before. This is the time to learn how to use Zoom. And then Agatha will come on at 11 o'clock next Tuesday. That's one time only, 11 o'clock next Tuesday, and do about a 45-minute tour of the Frist exhibit. I've been there, I've seen them in person, and I'm just fascinated. I cannot believe that in the 1300s, this kind of gorgeous handwork is being so carefully done, and then the students come along and write in the margins. That just blows my mind. On Thursday of next week, seniors helping others will go to the Second Harvest Food Bank and pack weekend goodie bags for needy children. We have to plan ahead, and we have to go there, and you have to register ahead because we have to fill out a form for Second Harvest Food Bank. So you call Karen Lackey or you call Robin Perea to register for that. And then finally, I want to tell you about a pilgrimage that we are taking from St. George's folks to Montgomery, Alabama on the weekend of the 25th and 26th of February. Marjorie and Richard Kennelly are leading this, and we will spend one night in Montgomery and tour the museums and hear from some of the staff there. It's a serious pilgrimage to help us understand our racial conflicts and our racial history. I encourage you to consider that. Now, next month's prime time is The Phantom Doctor.
Yes,
And
yes. So, and
tell us about The Phantom Doctor.
a note about the pilgrimage, Sewell and I will both be attending that pilgrimage. So really, as Sewell says, highly encourage if you want to do that. We're going to be riding down in a bus and leaving from the church. But do call me if you'd like more information on the pilgrimage. And I'm excited about it and excited to be traveling with Sewell. So yes, next month, I know everyone was excited in 2021 to hear about from Dr. Jeff Balzer, who is the head of everything at Vanderbilt, as you know, and we had a packed house registered to do that. I've heard from his office, he is prepared to come and be here with us, regardless of what anything's doing, on Thursday, February 17th at 11:30. I do anticipate that to be sort of a community-wide event. We'll try to social distance as much as possible. As y'all know, Hampton Hall's a pretty good-sized space, but I highly encourage you to go ahead and get your reservations in, either to myself or call the reservation line. And again, as Sewell said, I am here for you guys. My extension's 24/7. Please call me for any time, for anything. Thanks.
Don't call her 24/7 now, you all. That's her extension number. That's not her hours on duty, please. Anyway, if we may have to make some changes on Jeff Balzer's talk and move it into the church, but we will advise you. But everybody intends for it to be live and in person, and you may invite your friends, and we encourage you to invite your friends. And we will manage whatever size crowd signs up. So we may eat in one place and then go to the church to social distance better. Don't know yet, but we hope that the COVID will be cooperating with us this time. Anyway, today, what a great day. Annabeth Dooley is the curator of decorative arts at the Tennessee State Museum, and she was the lead curator in celebrating Tennessee's 225th anniversary by the highlights presentation that they have at the State Museum. It's been going on since June the 1st of last year, so we're just about in the 226th year, but that's all right. And it's been well received, it's exciting, and so we're going to look at it through the artifacts on display at the museum. Annabeth was a Bachelor of Arts graduate in history from Rhodes College in Memphis. She completed her master's in arts in the public history from Middle Tennessee State University. While at MTSU, she worked on local history projects across the state. She's a native of Jackson, Tennessee, and she has previously worked for the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area as a research curator. She has completed 2 internships with Colonial Williamsburg. She just told me she's recently married, but to a curator. So we are thrilled. Happy many years yet to come, Annabeth, and we're glad to have you today and to hear about the museum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sol. Thank you for the well wishes as well. As you see, it says Annabeth Hayes. I'm now Annabeth Dooley. I'm sorry for the confusion. But I am a curator of decorative arts now at the Tennessee State Museum, and while we couldn't join together today, I do invite you to come down to the museum in the Bicentennial Mall. We are open Tuesday through Sunday, and while we're so happy to be welcoming school groups back, we still invite families and couples to come, and we're open on the weekends if you'd rather kind of socially distance that way. And we are having small events and programs as well, both digitally and in the museum. But as Sol said, I am so delighted to share with you some of the highlights from the collection as part of this 225th anniversary celebration that we will be continuing into summer of this year. As he said, on June 1st of last year, we celebrated the 225th year of statehood, and the State Museum wanted to commemorate that by highlighting 100 objects out of the thousands that are just on display in the museum. And that was a tough task to think about the whole history of the state with just 100 objects. And so in doing so, we had an added layer to this goal that we wanted to look at stories from across time, across all 3 grand divisions of East, Middle, and West Tennessee. And that's a tall order, just to choose 100 objects to tell the stories of all Tennesseans across time and place. So, to do this, we came up with 5 themes that would kind of help navigate us through this process. And it would unify those objects, but as well as the people of our state. And those themes are art, service, community, transformation, and innovation. And so when you go through the exhibit, you will see markers across the museum of little flags on the objects that we've highlighted. You can pick up a brochure and help you as you go if you'd rather kind of follow that path, or you can choose your own path through the museum. You could spend all day there, or you can spend a couple hours. It's really your choice. And you can learn more about all of these objects that we selected if you'd rather stay at home through our website, which is tnmuseum.org. And we have a platform on the website where you can scroll through, read these stories, read some of the additional information that we've put online, and see really high-res photos if you'd rather stay at home, which we definitely understand right now. And you can see objects from a fossilized mastodon jaw to a spacesuit that was used by a Tennessee astronaut. But today we don't have time to go through all 100, so I chose 4 objects to speak to you about and to look at Tennesseans from across the state. And we're going to start in West Tennessee with the story of a woman named Doris Tanner, and she joined 2,000 other American women who became Air Force service pilots, better known as WASPs, during World War II. And to know how she joined this elite group of servicewomen, we have to go back a little bit. She was born in Dallas, but Doris actually graduated from Haywood High School in Brownsville, Tennessee, which is near Memphis. And then she went on to attend University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and it was in college that Doris was introduced to flying. She joined a friend who was taking lessons as part of the civilian pilot training program, and Doris wanted to try it for herself. So in 1940, when she graduated from UTK, she actually also got her private pilot's license. And she also met her future husband there as well, Bill Tanner. And over the next year and a half, Doris's life and that of the whole world would change with the onset of World War II. In the fall of 1941, she went back to Haywood County and became a teacher, and her fiancé, Bill, was stationed at Fort Bragg. And just a few months later, Pearl Harbor, as we know, was attacked on December 7th. So knowing that his deployment was imminent, Doris and Bill got married 3 months later. And during this time, Doris and other women were learning about the new ways that women could join the war effort from the home front. In 1942 of the same year that Doris and Bill got married, a small group of female pilots were already recruited to join the Women's Auxiliary Varying Squadron, which you don't have to remember that, WAFS. Another Tennessean from Nashville named Cornelia Fort was actually an inaugural member of this group. And a few months later, another female pilot program was established. This one was known as the Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFTD. You don't have to remember that either. In addition to ferrying, these pilots towed targets for the anti-aircraft weapons practice. So if you think about that, they're flying through the air as they're training these guns from the ground, and they slow-timed new engines, and they did other important duties. And these two programs merged to create the Women Air Force Service Pilots, which are the WASPs, which is what Doris would go on to join. And that was established in 1943. And Doris heard about these female pilot programs, and she wanted to get involved. So she traveled from Tennessee to Washington, D.C., and she interviewed to become a WASP. And between 1943 and 1944, 25,000 American women applied, but only 1,830 were accepted. In addition to teachers from Tennessee like Doris, women were from all over the United States. They were housewives, nurses, secretaries, factory workers, waitresses, students, and even actresses. And of the nearly 2,000 women that were accepted to the program, only a little over 1,000 actually completed the training. It was very elite. And of the initial requirements to join, the women had to be 21 years old at least, 5 feet tall, and pass the Form 64 physical by the flight surgeon. And most importantly, on their own time, they had to have already logged 200 hours of certified flying time, which, as we know, Doris had done in college. So after Doris was accepted, she traveled to Sweetwater, Texas, as you see here, and she lived at the airfield with her sister WASPs, known as the Avenger Airfield. And there they lived and breathed flying. The WASPs received training that was identical to that of their male cadet counterparts who were in the Army Air Force. And by training female pilots to serve and perform these tedious yet essential jobs were usually required of active duty members, it freed up the men to go abroad and serve in the actual war. And their tasks, like the women before them, included transporting administrative officers and medical personnel between bases across the country. They slow-timed new engines, again, and they tested and modified newly repaired planes, better than me. I don't think I could do that. And then they served as co-pilots for the male pilots who were trying to log their own flight time to get certified to then go abroad. And they also served as flight instructors for both female and male pilots. And again, they carried target sleeves for ground anti-aircraft gunnery practice for up to 5 hours at a time. And in some of her own interviews, Doris and other WASPs recalled that the gun crews would sometimes miss those targets, and they would hit the plane instead. And during the tenure, the WASPs ferried over 12,000 aircraft and logged over 60 million miles of non-combat missions. And because part of their duties were to ferry planes between factories and bases, the WASPs flew nearly every kind of plane that were used by American pilots in World War II. That was over 70 types of planes. And one of the most common ones that the WASP flew was the twin-engine UC-78, as you see here. It was known as the Bamboo Bomber because it was partly made of wood. So can you imagine carrying those target sleeves, flying this, a plane made of wood? Man, some very strong women. And Doris officially graduated her training and joined the WASPs on November 1st, 1943. And as was customary, a male relative was to pin their wings onto their uniform. And this is Doris right here. And because Doris's husband was still abroad, her uncle, named Boyd Russell, pinned her wings instead. And in the back of this image, if you look closely, you can see a little cartoon figure. And she is known as the Fifinella. Walt Disney actually designed this character to represent the WASPs and serve as their mascot. And this plane in this image belonged to Jacqueline Cochran, a famous female pilot of the time, who helped to organize the entire WASP organization, and she trained Doris and other pilots personally. Jacqueline worked to make sure that the WASP became an official women's service organization of the U.S. Air Force, which would allow a new level of entry for service women in the military, and then grant those WASPs veteran status, which would become important as they retired. But the measure was actually defeated by 19 votes in June of 1944, and by the end of that year, the WASPs were officially disbanded. After the war, women like Doris, who had been called upon and succeeded in these great new roles, now were meant to return home to their former lives. And in her interviews, Doris recalled being a WASP as one of the greatest times in her whole life, and it was difficult to have to give that up. But even so, she and Bill both returned home from the war, and they made their home a little further north with their family in Union City, Tennessee. Doris would go on to receive her master's degree and a doctorate in education, and later in life she became a professor of history at UT Martin. However, in her heart, she was always a WASP, and she continued to stay involved with her sisters. Shortly before the WASP disbanded, they established what's known as the Order of the Fifinella, that cartoon character, which served as a support system and membership base for her former WASPs. And here is a membership card, which was given to one of those WASPs, and that little Disney character is at the top. And this order published newsletters, they elected members to serve on a board, and Doris was very active within this order, and she and the other WASPs worked to gain that same recognition that Jacqueline had been working for to get these women veteran status as women pilots during World War II. And in 1977, Doris and her sisters worked with the United States senators and representatives to be officially recognized for their service to be honored as veterans, 33 years after the WASP had been disbanded. And in 2009, President Obama granted the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal for their service. 7 years later, Doris was recognized locally, and she was awarded the West Tennessee Sterling Award, which is a rather prestigious award in that area, and their first Outstanding Woman Military Award, which was also recognized by the Tennessee General Assembly. And she went on to publish several books, which you can get online, about her time as a WASP, and donated her uniform and other mementos related to her time in the military. And she donated those to the Tennessee State Museum, which you've seen this uniform off and on through this presentation, and to a few other local organizations as well. Miss Tanner passed away in 2019, but we are forever grateful for her military service and the impact that she had on Tennessee and our country. And we chose this particular object as part of Tennessee at 225, obviously for this great story that it tells, but it also shows the service that women had in war efforts across the country, as well as locally within our state. Now we are going to shift to another theme of the exhibit and another story. I mentioned art is one of the themes of 225, but art isn't just fine arts and painting, it also is music, which we know is central to what we know as Tennessee culture. We're going now to look at the life and legacy of the master harmonica player and early Opry star, DeFord Bailey. And although he made a name for himself on the music scene in Nashville, Bailey was actually born in 1899 in Smith County, Tennessee. And he lost his parents, unfortunately, at a very young age, and he was raised instead by his aunt and uncle. And when he was just a toddler, Bailey was also stricken with polio. And while we know this disease often paralyzed or unfortunately even killed young children, Bailey fortunately avoided those worst-case outcomes. But it did leave him frail through much of his childhood, and as you see here, it stunted his growth as well. And as an adult, he never reached over 5 feet tall. And because he didn't have the strength to work on the farm in the same way as his cousins and brothers and sisters, he actually instead spent much of his time learning how to play music. He came from a family of musicians who played the guitar, the banjo, the harmonica, and his grandfather was actually a famous local fiddler. And Bailey learned how to play more than one of these instruments, of course, but he started to become known in his own right for his own personal style of harmonica playing. He was influenced, of course, by his time growing up in rural Tennessee, and he mastered the harmonica to make it sound like the noises of his childhood, from church music to farm animals and even locomotives, those trains. He often walked by the railroad tracks and would practice making his harmonica sound like the bellowing of a train whistle, which would become one of his trademark sounds. He would also go on to play other songs that incorporated these unique sounds called the fox chase. Think of those farm animals being chased by the fox. And the famous song Pan American Blues, named after one of those trains on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. However, fame, of course, did not just come to Bailey. As a young African-American man growing up in the Jim Crow South, he had to navigate the options that were open to him. When he was about 18 years old, he moved to Nashville, since urban areas sometimes offered a few more job opportunities to African Americans. And to make his living, he worked as a houseboy in drugstores and as an elevator porter. But to pursue his passion for music, he continued to hone his craft by, in his little spare time that he had, going to local theaters and clubs where he would learn jazz, blues, and pop songs. And then he would incorporate that popular music of the day with those sounds that I mentioned earlier that he learned growing up. And that created his own unique approach to his harmonica playing. And it created this really wide repertoire of music. And after working and playing music on the side, Bailey finally hit one of his big breaks when he was about 25 years old. He met a man who owned a radio station and wanted to feature Bailey's harmonica playing. And after winning a radio contest, he became known as the Harmonica Wizard, a name that would follow him the rest of his career. And with his growing reputation, he met another harmonica player who had recently started playing for one of those new radio stations in town. You might have heard of it. It was called WSM. And Bailey soon became a frequent performer on George Hayes' Barn Dance, which we know today as the Grand Ole Opry. It was musicians like DeFord Bailey who helped define the early days of the Grand Ole Opry, with his songs again like the Fox Chase and Pan American Blues, inspired again by his childhood in rural Middle Tennessee. And of the 52 shows of the inaugural first year of the Opry, DeFord Bailey played 49 of them, more than twice as many as any other performer that year. And in 1928, he recorded music for companies like Victor and Columbia Records, and he actually recorded some of the first sessions ever held in Nashville. And over the next few years, Bailey became one of the Opry's biggest stars. By 1932, the radio station expanded its reach across the country, which introduced Bailey and the other musicians to a host of new fans and communities across the United States. And in addition to performing in Nashville, Bailey and those other artists traveled with the Opry performers across the South and Midwest, and they included Roy Acuff, Bill Monroe, and others. And despite Bailey's own popularity and reputation as an accomplished musician, he was also, as we know, an African-American man, and he was barred by those segregation laws from staying in the same hotels and eating in the same restaurants as the white Opry performers that he was traveling with. And although he had become one of the Opry's biggest stars, Bailey had to pretend to be the luggage boy for some of these artists to get into the same hotel and just to be able to stay the night. By the early 1940s, his radio career unfortunately came to an abrupt end. WSM, the radio station, wanted Bailey to play new songs that were not protected by an industry association known as the ASCAP. And this association charged licensing fees to that radio station when it played its members' songs, so it wasn't cost effective. But Bailey frequently played those songs, and they were his audience's favorites. That's why the audience was listening to Bailey, was to hear those songs that were unfortunately charged licensing fees. And he attested to that, and he said even the station wanted him to play those songs anyways. But by the end of 1941, WSM fired DeFord Bailey. Despite his impact on early country music and performers, DeFord Bailey spent the second half of his life away from his music career. Instead, he hosted boarders by renting rooms in his home, and he also opened a shoeshine parlor with his uncle. In 1974, though, he was invited to return to the Opry for the Old Timers reunion, which was held shortly before the Opry moved from the Ryman in downtown Nashville to its new location, where it is today, in Opryland. He played just a few more times after that, with his last performance in April of 1982, just 2 months before his death. And he was later inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2005. And this is a memorial service program for that induction ceremony that we do have at the museum. So we've talked now about service and art going from West and Middle Tennessee. And we're going to move a little bit further east into the Chattanooga area, and we're going to think about the transformation of the Tennessee cultural and physical landscape. To do this, I want to talk about a young woman named Nancy Reece, who is a Cherokee woman living near, again, present-day Chattanooga in Hamilton County. And we know about her story through a sampler, the one that you see here, that she created when she was just a student at the Brainerd Mission in that same region. She was born in 1815 to a biracial Cherokee family, and as a child, Nancy and her brothers were sent to attend school at this mission. It was established by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions along the Chickamauga Creek. And during the early to mid-19th century, this was very common. Many mission schools were established in an attempt to teach young Cherokee children a Western or American-style education. And Brainerd was actually in operation for over 20 years, closing during the final years of the Trail of Tears, which occurred throughout the 1830s. During its tenure, over 300 young Cherokee boys and girls attended Brainerd Mission, and it was students like Nancy who would learn Christian-based learning such as the Bible, hymns, and prayer, but then they would also learn how to read and write English and even geography. But it was slightly segregated based on sex. The boys would be taught vocational training, while the girls instead were responsible for learning the domestic arts, such as embroidery. And here is a contemporary drawing of what the Brainerd Mission looked like. It's in the collection of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in North Carolina, and you can kind of see how the school was set up across its landscape in Chattanooga. And so while Nancy was there to learn how to sew and embroider, she ultimately created this sampler when she was only about 8 years old. I could not do this at 8 years old, so again, I'm very impressed. As with many samplers, it included the alphabet, the number system sometimes, and it also would sometimes include verses from the Bible or famous poems. And we're always very lucky when samplers include the name of the person who made it. That's not always the case. But as you see here, kind of in the top near the middle, Nancy wrote, Nancy Reece, day June 21, 1823. And so at Brainerd, these student samplers later influenced other mission schools, and this practice was soon implemented in other Cherokee schools across the area. And this particular sampler includes a verse, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. So this is her implementing that Christian-based education. And unfortunately, even though these schools had a wide reach, they were often in need of funding. So there are letters from Nancy and other students that still survive today that they wrote to potential benefactors, and they tried to advocate for this funding by describing the type of education that they received, which is partly how we know what she was learning. And despite this induction of Cherokee children into a more Western way of life, the Cherokee and other southeastern Indian nations would soon be forced to leave their homes in the southeast, and they were forcibly removed to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And before she moved, Nancy married a young Cherokee man named Joseph Starr. But the year after that they got married, Nancy and Joseph Starr were among the first group of Cherokee to make that trek from the Chattanooga area to Oklahoma. And there were multiple routes to go on the Trail of Tears. Some were forced to walk, some were able to use horses and wagons, and other people had to cross bodies of water by boat. And the detachments, as they were called, were often led by white men who were known as conductors. The conductors would sometimes write daily journals, and that would allow them to monitor weather and travel conditions, which could then be useful to the groups that would follow after them. And one of these conductors was named B.B. Cannon, and we do have his journal, and his journal mentions that Nancy and her husband were among the 365 other Cherokee people on the northern route along the Trail of Tears. They had to travel across the Mississippi River into Missouri, traveling over 15 counties before ultimately traveling through Arkansas to then ultimately reach Oklahoma. And this was actually one of the safer routes along the Trail of Tears, and we know this because 2 other detachments would later follow the same route. And on December 15th, 1837, this conductor wrote something else in his journal. He wrote, "Joseph Starr's wife had a child last night." That would be Nancy. Nancy Reece Starr had her first child on the Trail of Tears after traveling 15 and a half miles in one day, and they traveled 10 and a half more the next. Ultimately, Nancy and her family were relocated to what's known as the Skin Bayou district of present-day Oklahoma. Their family were counted on the 1852 Drennan Roll, is what it's called, and this located families in the Indian Territory. We know that Nancy went on to have 2 more children, and she lived the rest of her life in Oklahoma before passing away in 1875. And Nancy Reece's story is one of transformation of the Tennessee landscape, but it demonstrates the impact of removal on the First Peoples and how that would later alter both our physical and cultural landscape as well. And the final object that we're going to talk about today is a little further more into East Tennessee in the Knoxville area. It's around the same time period, and it is called The Laws of the State of Tennessee. It was printed officially by George Ralstone in 1803. And George Ralstone was Tennessee's first state printer. And his wife, actually, Elizabeth Ralstone, would succeed him to become state printer after his death. Their story, however, actually begins a little bit earlier than this, as all stories do. George was born in Boston, and that's where he learned to become a printer. And he worked at a couple of Massachusetts newspapers before moving his business to Fayetteville, North Carolina. He did so in the late 1780s and worked on a few more newspapers. And while those papers weren't particularly well known or even that successful, his work did attract the attention of a man named William Blount. Born in North Carolina, William Blount was one of the North Carolina delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And by 1790, he was appointed by President George Washington to be the first governor of the Southwest Territory, which would become Tennessee. Blount and Ralstone probably met in Fayetteville, North Carolina, probably prior to Blount's move to the territory. And the soon-to-be Governor Blount saw the importance of establishing a newspaper to produce and distribute news and information if that region was to ultimately become a state. And he also probably saw how important it was to have a favorable press to his new government. And this painting that you see here was painted after his death by a Nashville painter who I'm sure many of you know as Washington B. Cooper. And in the mid-19th century, Cooper was recruited by the Tennessee Historical Society to create a series of portraits of Tennessee governors up to the time of the Civil War. And he was one of Nashville's most prolific painters, and it's estimated that he painted roughly 2,500 portraits throughout his career. But back to the Ralstones. Blount, as we know, did successfully recruit George Ralstone to move his printing press from North Carolina across the Appalachian Mountains to ultimately set up in the newly formed Southwest Territory. And George Ralstone must have seen the opportunity that this presented, and particularly to work so closely with a new territorial governor. So he followed the journey that his future wife would take as well. Again, he packed up that printing press, just like the one you would see here, carried it over the Appalachian Mountains, likely by a wagon, and set up his new printing office in Rogersville. And in doing so, he became the region's first printer, establishing what would become the state's first newspaper. And like I said, he was in Rogersville, but he named this newspaper the Knoxville Gazette. And he did this because he knew that they weren't going to stay in Rogersville very long, and he didn't want to have to change the name of the newspaper twice. So he named it in anticipation of the new capital. And so when the new capital was officially established a town over, he packed up that press again and moved it, this time probably by boat because it was more convenient, and moved it to Knoxville the next year in 1792, just 4 years before Tennessee would officially become a state. And the press that you see here is actually a reproduction of an 18th century printing press, but it is very similar to the one that the Ralstones would have used. And it is an active printing press. We do demonstrations with it, and sometimes you can have a takeaway if if they're so likely to give you one. In just 3 years after Ralston moved to the Southwest Territory, his life changed again when he married a woman named Elizabeth Gilliam, who would become Elizabeth Ralston. And after their marriage, George's star continued to rise. The governor and George worked very well together, and he was rewarded for his loyalty with many desirable appointments. Especially a new settler in the territory would have coveted something like this. And what you see here is William Blount's office, which was preserved, and it still stands in Knoxville today. And it is still likely the one that George Ralston would have visited to go talk about their business dealings together. And just some of George's new positions included being appointed to serve as a trustee of Blount College, which is the predecessor to UT Knoxville. He was appointed as Knoxville's first postmaster and a commissioner. And after Tennessee officially became a state in 1796, he was finally formally elected by the General Assembly to become the official state printer. But one of his greatest accomplishments was printing the book that you saw in the beginning of this talk called The Laws of the State of Tennessee. It would become the area's most important legal text of the time, and it held all of the publishings of what was happening with the General Assembly. So anything that they officially decided during that time was published in this book. And this copy is in the State Museum's collection. We acquired it about 4 years ago, and it is it's one of my most coveted objects in the collection just because of this story, and it is on display. And while George's name would have been on the door, there would have been multiple people working behind the scenes to make the business run. In addition to journeymen and possible enslaved people, George's family would have worked alongside him as well, including his wife, Elizabeth. Born in Virginia, Elizabeth ultimately moved to East Tennessee with her family when she was just a young girl. Like many future Tennesseans, her father was awarded a land grant as part of his service in the Revolutionary War. And as a young woman, she married George Ralston and would work alongside him in the print shop, because print shops were often family-run businesses. And even though her name was not on the door, she was very likely a silent partner during his rise to success. And what you see here is a plate from what's known as Didaro's Encyclopedia, and it depicts a group of workers in a bookbinding shop dated around 1770, and you see that the second person from the left sitting at the table is a woman. And her depiction from a contemporary source further enforces that multiple people were involved in this type of work. And so this image of an unnamed woman could very well have been Elizabeth, working silently in the shop, sewing the bindings of the laws of Tennessee. And even as George Ralston continued to collect all of those appointments and positions around the city, times were actually financially tough for the family, because most of those positions offered prestige rather than payment. And when the laws of the state of Tennessee was published in 1803, George Ralston sent a bill for the book and a newspaper subscription to the Gazette to a young lawyer in Nashville, you might have heard of him, Andrew Jackson. And as someone reading this letter, as you see here, over 200 years later, I find it interesting for two reasons. Because George tells Andrew Jackson that George has been sick. He's been confined to his bed for the past several days. And secondly, he also tells Andrew Jackson that he is much distressed for money and even apologizes for troubling Jackson with a bill. While we don't know how Jackson responded, we do know that George Ralston died less than a year later. And this means, again, that it is very likely that Elizabeth was the one who stepped in to complete was crucial to the book's completion. She's probably doing more than just sewing the bindings of those books. And when we refer to this book as Ralston's Laws, as it was commonly known, we should actually consider that this name refers to both George and Elizabeth. And when George dies the next year, he left behind Elizabeth, their 5 children, and a business to run. And he had recently only just been reelected to his position of state printer. The records show, however, that it was Elizabeth's family who were the executors of his estate, and they were crucial with tasking the completion of his printing duties, and that was part of their responsibilities as executors. And while these were smart, influential men as executors, they had no experience in running a printing business. Elizabeth, however, had already been living and working alongside her husband for over 10 years. So instead of trying to learn a new trade, it's more likely that these men turned to Elizabeth to complete that task. And like I said, I do realize that Elizabeth had 5 children to raise at the same time. They ranged from 10 years old to just a newborn. However, we have to also remember what George told Andrew Jackson. They were financially distressed. So to keep that business afloat in the most economical way possible, it's likely that she took to the task in the same way George had done, working with those behind-the-scenes players, whether that was journeymen or enslaved people, or if her children were in the shop as well. And this is a 1805 edition of the Knoxville Gazette. And in this edition, you see the name John Hood as listed as the publisher. John Hood was one of those journeymen working in the shop. But because of the age of this paper, part of the text has faded away. So I like to kind of postulate that maybe the name also mentions the Ralstones as well. Additionally, Elizabeth's oldest son would later take over that family newspaper business, so he was probably receiving his own training from both of his parents. When the elections for state printer opened again in 1806, Elizabeth decided to run for office under her own name, and the ballot came down between her and another Knoxville printer named George Wilson. No relation, so we'll just call him Wilson. Wilson was a frequent competitor of the Ralstones, and he ran his own newspaper, which was conveniently called Wilson's Knoxville Gazette. And after George Ralstone's death 2 years earlier, the General Assembly could have very easily turned to Wilson to fill this office. But Elizabeth won the election by a near landslide, at least in terms of 19th century elections. She won 28-7. And the General Assembly's voting record is actually a testament to their own confidence in Elizabeth's own ability to successfully perform these duties. And with her election, she became Tennessee state printer, which also made her the state's first female elected official. And what you see here is an image of the 1806 Acts of the General Assembly, and it features what's known as an imprint. It's the name or the publishing information at the bottom, and it has Elizabeth Ralstone's name and her new title. And you'll see again John Hood's name underneath it because they were probably working together in the same shop. But Elizabeth's time in the public spotlight and the documentary record, however, was cut short because she remarries just a few years later to a man named William Moore. He had also served in the Revolutionary Army, and it's likely that he also received a land grant and moved to Tennessee, probably in Sumner County. And Moore was elected to be a Tennessee legislator. So this is probably how he met Elizabeth. He would come to Knoxville when a General Assembly was in session, and as state printer, they dealt a lot with the General Assembly and their publications. So after their marriage, he immediately gained control, though, over all of Elizabeth's assets, including the printing press, the bookbinding office, and the newspaper. And despite officially still being public printer, Elizabeth's name and title were now conditioned with that of her new husband. After their marriage, most of the official documents referred to William Moore on behalf of his wife, Elizabeth Ralstone, public printer, or they would just cut it short and say William Moore, state printer, even though he was not the one elected yet. And the term of state printer was typically about 2 years, but a new election was held just the following year for the same position. We don't know why, though. William Moore formally ran this time, once again against the man Wilson, and William Moore did win the election, but this time by a much narrower margin than that of his wife. He only won by 5 votes. And this is an 1807 Journal of the Senate, which is in the State Museum's collection, and it documents the minutes of that election that William Moore won, and again bears the imprint of his name as state printer. Shortly after that election, the family decided to relocate, though. They moved this time to Carthage, Tennessee, and they moved the newspaper and the printing press and all that comes with it to Carthage as well. And after they moved, they renamed the newspaper the Carthage Gazette. And William Moore decided to publish an editorial to be as frank as he could with his new readers, to talk about a new partnership, someone that was going to come help with the newspaper. And in this edition, he also writes an interesting comment. I'm going to read it to you. He says, "By my marriage with the widow of Mr. George Ralstone, late printer to the state, I have become possessed of the most extensive printing office that ever has been used in the state, consisting of a great variety of types, printing presses, and a bookbinding apparatus. I have likewise succeeded Mr. Ralstone in the appointment of printer of the state." Did you notice something? That he did not mention Elizabeth was the one that came between them? He failed to mention that his wife had actually been elected to that position before him. And what's interesting is that in another comment, William Moore also writes that he is no printer. He kind of acknowledges that he really doesn't know what he's doing. So without admitting it fully, Elizabeth is still probably the one behind the scenes working with her children from her first marriage, running the business, or at least training them to do so. But again, her name now disappears from that documentary record. But we know that as her previous role as state printer, she would have, at least for a brief period of time, been known in cities across the state, because the laws of the state of Tennessee and any publications done under her tenure would have been distributed among lawyers and other people of affluence, and they would have seen the name Elizabeth Ralstone. And the laws of the state of Tennessee, that book in the very beginning, held a seminal role as the foremost legal text until John Haywood would publish his revisal 5 years later. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning about just a few of the stories featured in Tennessee at 225. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you explore more of these stories, whether online or you come visit us at the museum. And I hope you think about how these themes and these stories have shaped where we are today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annabeth. Fascinating stories. And I wondered how you were going to deal with all of this, and I think that you all have dealt with it in the way that is most memorable, and that is through the lives of 4 people, very diverse, but all of them achievers, and all of them with a lot of drive, and who overcame great handicaps, societal handicaps, marital handicaps, mother raising 5 children, all the handicaps were there. I think that's a great message to all of us. When we get a little bit sort of whiny every once in a while, we can think about these 4 individuals who, they may have whined, but they kept on going too. So thank you. And I want to remind you of your opportunities next week. The tour of the Frist with Agatha Nolan, and you need to, of course, make your reservation and get your link for the Zoom call with Robin Pereira. Seniors Helping Others on Thursday at Second Harvest Food Bank. That's very important. And then we have, looking forward to having Dr. lost his name now, Robin? Jeff Balzer. Sorry about that. Senior moments happen, yes, they do. So anyway, we'll have, and we'll try not to forget Jeff Balzer's name when he gets here too. So look forward to all the opportunities St. George's has for you to do. Let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. Hallelujah. Thank you.